There are two kinds of secrets inside a marriage. The first kind is the one that destroys things. The one that lives in the dark and feeds on darkness and grows until it takes up more space than the marriage itself can hold. The one that, when it finally comes into the light, leaves nothing standing. And then there is the second kind. The second kind is rarer, much rarer. The kind that also lives in the dark, also hidden, also carried quietly, also involving a separate phone and Tuesday evenings and whispered conversations in another room and all the specific signs that make a person's stomach drop when they notice them. The second kind looks exactly like the first kind. Until it doesn't. Robert Coleman had been a school principal for 22 years. He had spent his entire career teaching young people the difference between what something looks like and what something is. He had stood in front of classrooms and told hundreds of students that assumptions are not the same as evidence, that the story you tell yourself about a situation is not always the true story. That patience, genuine patience, the kind that waits for the full picture before drawing the conclusion, is one of the most important things a person can practice. He had spent 22 years believing this. And then his wife got a second phone. And she started disappearing on Tuesday and Friday evenings. And she started taking calls in the bedroom with the door closed. And the man who had spent 22 years teaching young people not to assumed, on a Wednesday afternoon in October 2024, in a studio in Atlanta, Georgia, Robert Coleman sat across from Steve Harvey and said something he had been holding for 8 months. Something he had not said to his wife directly. Something he had carried in the private, awful way that a person carries a fear they have not yet confirmed, hoping that saying it out loud might make it less true. What Steve Harvey did next, what he had arranged in the 40 minutes before the taping began, with the specific help of the Coleman family, changed everything Robert Coleman thought he knew about the 8 months he had just lived through, and about the woman he had been married to for 30 years. And about a man he had not spoken to in 46 years. This is the story of Robert and Patricia Coleman. And before it is over, you will understand that the woman who looked like she was betraying her husband was actually doing the most protective thing one person can do for another. She was deciding whether he was ready to be healed. Robert James Coleman was born in 1966 in Nashville, Tennessee, the older of 2 sons. His mother, Gloria, was a home economics teacher at the high school 3 blocks from their house. His father, Earl, was a long-haul truck driver who came and went on schedules that had nothing to do with the rhythms of the family and everything to do with the routes he was assigned, until the summer of 1978. That summer, Earl Coleman stopped coming back. Not dramatically, not with a fight or a scene or an explanation that Robert could replay in his head later and try to understand. He simply stopped. 1 week, he was there. The next week, he was not. And the week after that, his mother sat Robert and his younger brother down at the kitchen table and told them that their father was not coming home and that she was going to need them to be strong. Robert was 12 years old. He did what 12-year-old boys do when they are told to be strong by a mother who is clearly not as strong as she is trying to appear. He became strong immediately. Completely. And with a thoroughness that would shape every significant decision he made for the next 46 years. He did not cry in front of his mother. He did not ask questions she could not answer. He took on the oldest son responsibilities without being asked, looking after his younger brother Marcus, doing the things around the house that required someone taller and older than his mother to do them, getting a paper route at 13 and handing her the money without making it a moment. He did not talk about Earl Coleman after the summer of 1978. Not to his mother, not to Marcus, not to friends. Earl Coleman was simply removed from the operational picture of Robert's life the way a principal removes a dysfunctional element from a school environment. Efficiently, completely, without sentiment. He became a teacher in 1989. He moved into administration in 1996. He was a school principal for 22 years. First at a middle school in East Nashville, then at a high school in the Antioch community where he built a program that was studied and replicated by 3 other districts. He was not a loud principal. He was not a political one. He was the kind who knew every student's name and the name of their parents and, very often, the name of whatever was happening at home that was making the student sit in the back of class looking like they were carrying something they could not put down. He recognized that look. He had worn it at 12. He met Patricia Ann Williams in 1991 at a teacher's professional development workshop in Nashville. She was 23 years old, already in her pediatric nursing program, and she had attended the workshop because a professor had assigned a cross-disciplinary observation project that required her to spend a day in an educational setting. She sat in the back of the workshop for the first hour, taking notes with the efficient attention of someone who was used to gathering information in high-pressure environments and retaining it accurately. Robert noticed her during the break because she was the only person in the room whose notes appeared to be organized by a color-coded system. He introduced himself. She told him she was not a teacher. He said he had figured that out from the organized notes. She looked at him with an expression that was neither offense nor amusement but contained elements of both. And he decided in that moment that she was the most interesting person in the room. They went to coffee after the workshop. They talked for 2 hours about children, the ones she was learning to care for medically and the ones he was learning to guide educationally, and found that they had arrived at the same fundamental belief from 2 completely different professional directions. That children reveal what they need if you give them enough space to reveal it. That the job in both their fields was mostly a matter of creating enough quiet around the child that the truth could surface on its own. He proposed in 1993. She said yes. They were married in August 1994. 2 children, Jasmine, now 32, working in corporate training in Atlanta. Deshawn, 29, a physical therapist in Nashville. The family was close in the particular way of families that have been built by 2 people who understood that closeness is something you choose every day and not something that maintains itself automatically. 30 years. That was what Robert and Patricia had. 30 years of choosing each other, of the ordinary mornings and the hard seasons and the specific intimacy of 2 people who have seen each other through enough that there is nothing left to perform. Patricia retired from her pediatric nursing career in 2022 after 30 years of it. Robert retired from his principalship the same year. They had talked, for the last years of their careers, about what retirement would look like, the traveling they would do, the grandchildren they would eventually have, the pace they would finally allow themselves. In February 2024, Patricia bought a second phone. She told Robert it was for a specific app that her existing phone did not have the capacity for. He accepted this. It was a plausible explanation. He moved on. In March, she started disappearing on Tuesday evenings. She said she was meeting a friend from her nursing years, a woman named Beverly who had moved to the Nashville area and wanted company on her Tuesday night pottery class. Robert knew Beverly existed. He had met her twice. He accepted this. In April, the Friday evenings started. She said she was helping Beverly with a project. In May, he heard her in the bedroom with the door closed, speaking quietly into the second phone. He could not hear the words. He heard the tone, careful, low, with the particular quality of a voice that is managing something. In June, he saw her delete a text thread on the second phone. Not hide it, delete it. The specific act of a person removing a record. He did not say anything. He was a man who had spent 22 years teaching young people that assumptions are not evidence. He applied the same standard to himself. He waited. He watched. He gave her every reasonable interpretation and held on to it as long as he could. By October, 8 months after the second phone, he had run out of reasonable interpretations. He had not said one word to Patricia, but Jasmine had submitted the Family Feud application in July, and Steve Harvey's production team had done their pre-interview due diligence. And Jasmine, who knew everything, because Jasmine was her mother's daughter, and her mother had needed one person to know. Had made a phone call to the producer the morning of the taping. The producer had made a phone call of his own. And in a room down the hall from the green room, while Robert Coleman was getting his microphone fitted and thinking about survey questions, something was being arranged that he did not know about. Something that Patricia had been building for 8 months. Something that was about to change the shape of everything he thought the last 46 years had been. Jasmine had submitted the application because she needed a controlled environment. She was 32 years old, and she had inherited equal measures of her father's strategic thinking and her mother's emotional precision, and she had understood. When her mother finally told her what she had been doing for the past months, that this information could not simply be delivered at a kitchen table. It was too large for a kitchen table. It required space and structure, and ideally a professional mediator who was very good at managing unexpected emotional situations in front of an audience. Steve Harvey had 20 years of experience being exactly that. She had submitted the application in July and told her father it was an anniversary gift. Robert had agreed with the particular mild enthusiasm of a man whose mind was significantly occupied elsewhere. The team was 4: Robert, Patricia, Jasmine, and Deshawn, who had driven up from Nashville and had been told by Jasmine only that today was going to be a significant day and that he should be prepared. Deshawn had looked at his sister and said, "How significant?" And Jasmine had said historically significant, and Deshawn had spent the drive to Atlanta in a state of alert readiness that expressed itself as unusual quietness. The drive itself was 3 hours of the specific tension that moves through a car when 2 people in the front seats are each carrying something the other one does not know they are carrying. Patricia drove. Robert sat beside her and watched the Georgia landscape and asked standard questions about the show's format that Jasmine answered from the back seat. Patricia answered when directly addressed. Robert watched her hands on the wheel with the particular attention of a man who has been watching someone carefully for 8 months. Patricia felt him watching. She always had. The studio received them warmly. The production team was organized and specific in a way that, in retrospect, had the quality of people who were managing more moving pieces than a standard taping required. A producer came in and spoke to each of them briefly. When he reached Jasmine, he held her gaze for just a moment with an expression that communicated, "It is arranged." She gave the smallest nod. The opposing family was the Morrison family from Chattanooga, grandparents, an adult daughter, and a teenage grandson who had clearly spent serious time studying the show. They were quick and organized and jumped to an early lead in the first 2 rounds that made Deshawn visibly recalibrate. He steadied the team in the 3rd round. Deshawn had his mother's instinct for reading a room and his father's composure under pressure, and the combination produced a player who was at his best when things were going wrong, which was when it mattered. 2 strong answers in the 3rd round closed the gap. Patricia was precise and fast in the way of someone who had spent 30 years in pediatric nursing, making quick, accurate assessments and acting on them without hesitation. She moved through her answers with the efficiency of someone for whom the format, observe, assess, respond, was simply the way she moved through the world. 3 answers on the board in the middle rounds, including one number 1 that pulled the family into the lead. Robert answered with the steady authority of a retired school principal, which is to say, he answered as a man who has spent 22 years being the calmest person in every room he entered regardless of what the room was doing. Measured, certain, not quick, but accurate. In the 4th round, with the score close and the Morrison family applying pressure, Steve Harvey directed a question to Robert as part of the normal game flow. The question was, name something a man notices when something in his marriage has changed. The audience answered in the warm, knowing way of people who found the question relatable. Robert answered without pausing. "Her eyes," he said. "The way she looks at you is different." The board confirmed it, the number 2 answer, 33 points. The audience applauded. Patricia was standing 3 feet from her husband when he said it. She did not move. But something moved through her face. Not guilt, not fear, but something more specific. Something that looked like a woman receiving confirmation of something she had suspected and had hoped she was wrong about. She had not known he had noticed. She had thought she had been careful enough. Jasmine watched from the side of the stage. She looked at her father. She looked at her mother. She saw both of them simultaneously in the full weight of what they were each carrying. And she looked toward the side of the stage where the producer was standing. The producer gave her the smallest nod. It was time. The Mitchell family won the main game 322 to 297. The celebration was muted by the specific collective awareness that something in the room had shifted during the fourth round answer. Deshawn celebrated. Jasmine was composed. Patricia smiled. Robert smiled. They did not look at each other while smiling. Steve Harvey did his walk down the contestant line before Fast Money. He talked to Deshawn, who was charming and warm and his mother's son in ways that the audience immediately recognized. He talked to Jasmine with a specific attentiveness that she received without revealing anything. He talked to Patricia. He stopped in front of her and looked at her the way he looked at people when something in their pre-interview had told him there was more below the surface than the surface showed. Patricia, he said. 30 years. 30 years, she confirmed. Pediatric nurse for 30 of those years. Yes, you spent 30 years, Steve said, taking care of children who were not yours. Children whose parents needed someone to step in and be present and make sure the child was going to be all right. Patricia looked at him. She understood that he was not making casual conversation. Yes, she said. That is one way to describe it. Is it a habit? Steve asked carefully. Stepping in to take care of something before the person who most needs it is ready to know about it? Patricia was quiet for just a moment. Sometimes, she said, the person who needs the care most is the last person who should know it is coming. She paused. Because knowing it is coming changes what it does. Steve held her gaze for a moment. Then he moved to Robert. He sat in the low chair. He looked at this man, 58 years old, retired school principal. 22 years of building something reliable, 30 years married, 8 months of carrying something he had not said out loud to the person who most needed to hear it. Robert, Steve said. 30 years of marriage. Yes, sir, Robert said. Former school principal. 22 years. You taught young people, Steve said, to wait for the full evidence before drawing a conclusion. Robert looked at him. I did, he said. Steve looked at him steadily. Have you been practicing that yourself lately? The studio went still. Robert looked at Steve Harvey. He looked at the chair the man was sitting in. He looked at his own hands for a moment. Then he looked across the stage at his wife. Patricia was already looking at him. No, Robert said quietly. I don't think I have. Steve Harvey nodded slowly. Robert, he said, your daughter told us something this morning, in the pre-interview. Something your wife has been doing for the past 8 months that you do not know about. Robert was very still. I want to ask you something first, Steve said. Before we get into it, I want you to think about it honestly. He paused. When you were 12 years old, your father left, and you have not spoken to him since. The color of the room changed. Not literally, but in the way that rooms change when something is said that reorients the whole of what everyone in them thought they were watching. Robert Coleman sat in the contestant chair on the Family Feud stage and felt the floor shift beneath him in the specific way it had last shifted when he was 12 years old and his mother had sat him at the kitchen table and told him his father was not coming home. No, he said. His voice was level the way things are level when the effort of keeping them level is very high. I have not. Do you know where he is? Steve asked. I have not looked, Robert said. No, Steve said. But someone did. Robert turned and looked at his wife. Patricia did not look away. She had been waiting for this moment for 8 months, had been building toward it, managing it, protecting him from it until she was certain it was safe to deliver. She looked at her husband across the stage with the composed, complete attention of a woman who has made a very large decision and has made peace with every part of it. 8 months ago, Patricia said. And her voice was steady in the way it was steady when she sat beside the bed of a sick child and spoke to the parents. Certain, clear. Carrying something large without letting the weight of it destabilize the delivery. I received a letter. Robert waited. It was addressed to you, she said. It came to the house. It was from a man named Earl Coleman. Your father. The studio produced a sound, not quite a gasp, not quite silence. Something between. He is 78 years old, Patricia said. He is living in an assisted living facility in Clarksville, Tennessee, 45 minutes from our house. He has been living there for 4 years. She paused. The letter said he had early-stage dementia, that his memory was beginning to go, that he had spent the last decade trying to find you and had finally located our address through public records, that he did not expect forgiveness, that he only wanted you to know he was sorry, that he wanted to say it before he could no longer remember what he was sorry for. Robert was not moving. I read that letter, Patricia said, and I made a decision. I did not tell you about it immediately, and I want to explain why. She looked at him directly. Because I know you, she said. I have known you for 30 years, and I know what that letter would have done to you if I had simply handed it to you. You would have sat with it alone. You would have managed it alone. You would have made a decision from inside 12 years of being 12 years old and abandoned, without any information about who this man is now, who he has become, what he is actually carrying, whether what he is offering is real. She stopped. I did not want you to make that decision without the full evidence. A sound moved through the audience, warm, immediate, recognizing, so I went to see him, Patricia said. On the first Tuesday, Robert closed his eyes. Just for a moment. Just briefly. I told him who I was. I told him I was your wife, and that I had received his letter, and that I was not prepared to hand it to my husband until I had assessed the situation myself. She almost smiled at her own word choice. I am a pediatric nurse. I assess situations. It is what I do. The audience laughed, the soft, gentle kind. I spent 8 months, Patricia said, visiting your father. Every Tuesday and Friday. I got to know him. I asked him the hard questions. Why he left, what happened, what kind of man he became after. I assessed whether what he was offering was real, or whether it was the desperation of a sick old man reaching for absolution he had not earned. She stopped. I wanted to know if you would be hurt or healed by meeting him. I needed to be sure before I brought it to you. Because protecting you from things that will hurt you more than help you is, she stopped, it is what I have always done. It is what I am built to do. I know that is not always the right call. I know you deserve to make your own decisions. But I could not hand you something that large without knowing first what it was made of. Robert was looking at his wife. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who has been carrying one story for 8 months and has just been given a completely different one, who is in the process, in real time, of understanding that the thing he thought he had lost was never what he thought it was. He is a different man. Patricia said quietly, I want you to know that. I am not saying what he did was forgivable. That is not my call. It is yours. I am not saying you owe him anything. But I spent 8 months sitting across from him every Tuesday and Friday, and he is a man who has been carrying the weight of 1978 for 46 years, and it has cost him everything. She paused. He remembers you at 12. He remembers specific days. He told me about a Little League game in June 1977 when you hit a double, and he was in the stands, and he was so proud he stood up and knocked over the man's coffee in front of him. He told me about the morning he left. He told me what he has told himself about it for 46 years. She stopped. His memory is going. Robert. There are Tuesdays when he is sharp and Tuesdays when he is not. But every Tuesday, every single one, when I walked in, he knew my name. Because I was the woman married to his son. The studio was completely silent. Steve Harvey had stood up at some point during Patricia's telling. He was standing at the side of the stage with his hand pressed flat over his heart and his eyes, doing what they did when he had given up managing them. "Patricia," Steve said when she stopped. His voice was rough. "You spent 8 months deciding whether your husband was ready to receive his father." "I spent 8 months," she said, "deciding whether his father had earned the right to be received." Steve pressed his hand over his mouth. He stood like that for a moment. Then he turned toward the side of the studio, toward a door that had been closed for the entire taping, and he gave a small nod to the producer standing beside it. The door opened. A man walked in. He was 78 years old. He was moving slowly, with the careful deliberateness of age and the particular uprightness of a man who understood that this was not the moment to be anything less than fully present. He was wearing a dark jacket and a collared shirt, and he had Robert's height, Robert's exact height, and Robert's jaw, and Robert's hands, large and certain even at 78 years old. Earl Coleman walked through the door of the Family Feud studio in Atlanta, Georgia, and stopped when he found his son. He stood 30 feet away, and he looked at the man his 12-year-old boy had become, and he did not say anything. He was not capable of saying anything. He simply stood and looked, the way a person looks when they have been waiting 46 years for a sight, and have it finally in front of them, and are not yet sure they have the right to move toward it. Robert Coleman turned and saw his father. The studio watched it happen, watched it travel through Robert's face in the way that something travels through a person when the ground beneath them is shifting and has not finished shifting, and they do not know yet where it is going to settle. Not anger, not relief, not joy. Something that had all three inside it and had not yet become any one of them. Steve Harvey stepped back. He moved to the side of the stage the way he moved when he understood that the stage no longer belonged to him, when it had become someone else's floor, someone else's moment, and his job was simply to hold the space around it. Patricia walked to her husband. She stood beside him. She did not touch him. She stood beside him the way she had stood beside parents in hospital rooms when their child was in surgery, close enough to reach if needed, still enough not to interfere. "He cannot come to you," she said quietly, "not to the audience, to Robert. He is too ashamed to close that distance without knowing if you will let him. But he can stand in this room." She paused. "What you do with that is yours." Robert looked at his wife. He looked at her for a long moment, 30 years of looking at her across tables and rooms and stages and everything in between, and he understood completely and finally what the second phone had been for, what the Tuesday evenings had been, what the quiet conversations behind closed doors had contained. She had not been protecting a secret from him. She had been protecting him from a meeting he was not yet ready for, with a man he had not yet had the information to receive. She had been doing what she had done for 30 years of pediatric nursing and 30 years of marriage. She had been assessing the situation first so that the care she delivered would actually heal and not harm. "Did you decide?" Robert said. "Quietly, I decided 8 months ago," Patricia said. "I just needed you to know who he is now before you decided." Robert turned and looked at his father across the studio floor. Earl Coleman had not moved. He was standing inside the door where he had stopped. His hands were at his sides, and his jaw was set in the specific way that Robert had seen in mirrors for 58 years and had never had a name for until this moment. Robert walked toward him. Not quickly. Not with the momentum of resolution or forgiveness or anything that had already been decided. Just toward him. One step, and then another. in the way that a man walks towards something when he does not yet know what it will be when he gets there, but understands that the walking is the only available response. Earl Coleman saw his son coming. He did not move. He stood and he waited, and when Robert reached him and stopped in front of him, Earl Coleman looked at his son with the expression of a man who has been rehearsing a moment for 46 years and has discovered, now that it is here, that none of the rehearsal was adequate for the actual size of it. "I don't have the right to ask you for anything," Earl said. His voice was the voice of an old man, but it carried something young inside it, something that had been kept preserved by shame and time. "Your wife has been. She has been coming to see me. Every week. She sat across from me every week, and she asked me questions I didn't deserve to be asked kindly. And she asked them kindly anyway." He stopped. "She told me you were a good man. She said it like it was something she needed me to understand, like she was proud of it and wanted to make sure I knew." His voice broke, once, precisely. "I did not make you a good man. I left when you were 12, and whatever you are now, you made yourself." He stopped. "I just wanted you to know that I know that, and that I am sorry. I have been sorry for 46 years, and I did not know how to say it, and now my memory is going, and I needed to say it before I forgot what I was sorry for." Robert stood in front of his father. He stood there for a long time. Steve Harvey, from the side of the stage, was completely undone. He was not attempting anything. He was simply standing with both hands pressed over his face and his eyes closed, and the full weight of what was happening in front of him doing what it was doing. The audience was silent in the full way, the complete way. Jasmine had her hands over her mouth. Deshaun had his arm around his sister, and he was looking at his grandfather with the expression of a young man encountering the source of something he has always seen downstream and is only now understanding the origin of. Patricia was standing where she had been standing, still, close enough to reach if needed. Exactly right. Robert Coleman looked at his father. He looked at the height they shared and the jaw and the hands. He looked at 78 years of a life he had not witnessed. He looked at the shame that was written into the old man's posture, even as the old man held himself upright. He thought about 12 years old, about the kitchen table, about his mother's face, about 30 years of being very careful to show up for every person in his life so that no one who depended on him would ever stand in the kitchen of a house that used to be full and receive the news that he was not coming back. He thought about Patricia. About 8 months of Tuesday evenings. About a woman who had looked at the complexity of what was in front of her and had done what she had always done, assessed it carefully, protected the people in her care, delivered the intervention only when she was certain it would heal. He thought about what it had cost her to carry that alone. He thought about what it had cost his father to stand in this room. "Patricia says your memory is going," Robert said. "Some days are clearer than others," Earl said. "Then I need to ask you something now," Robert said. "While it's clear." Earl waited. "The Little League game," Robert said. June 1977. Something moved through Earl Coleman's face, surprise first, and then something that was not surprise, but was adjacent to it. The expression of a man who has been told that a person knows something he did not expect them to know. "You hit a double," Earl said, "off a left-handed pitcher. You pulled it down the first baseline and it went into the corner and you made it to second standing up." His voice was certain, clear every word of it. "I knocked over a man's coffee when I stood up. He was very unhappy about it." Robert looked at his father. "You were there," Robert said. "I was there," Earl said. "For every game that summer. You never saw me. I sat in the back." Robert stood very still. "I was always in the back," Earl said quietly, after 1978. "I was always somewhere in the back. I did not have the right to be in the front, but I was there." Something happened to Robert Coleman's face. It was not a dramatic thing. It was not the kind of thing that announces itself. It was the very specific, very quiet thing that happens to a person's face when a story they have been telling themselves for 46 years. A story about being left, about being not enough to make a man stay, suddenly has a piece added to it that changes the shape of the whole thing. He had not been watched from a distance. He had been watched from the back row. For 46 years. Steve Harvey lowered his hands from his face and looked at the two men standing inside the door of his studio, and he said nothing. He was the host of a game show, and he said nothing, because there was nothing a host of a game show could say that would not be smaller than what was happening in front of him. Robert put his arms around his father. Earl Coleman held on with the specific grip of a 78-year-old man holding the one thing he had not believed he would be allowed to hold again. Patricia watched from across the studio floor with her hands folded in front of her and her eyes doing the quiet, steady thing they did when she had delivered a care intervention and it had gone the way she had hoped it would go. Not perfectly, not without cost, but in the direction of healing rather than harm. She had assessed correctly. She always had. Steve Harvey walked toward her. He stopped in front of her and he looked at her and he shook his head slowly in the way of a man who has run out of words and is not sorry about it. "You knew," he said. "You knew for 8 months what that man was carrying, and you did not hand it to your husband until you were certain it was safe." "I am a pediatric nurse," Patricia said. "You do not give a patient a treatment before you know what it will do." Steve Harvey looked at her. "Mrs. Coleman," he said, "you spent 8 months visiting a 78-year-old man with failing memory every Tuesday and Friday in a nursing home in Clarksville to make sure that when your husband met his father, it would help him and not hurt him." He stopped. "You took on somebody else's 46 years of unfinished business, and you carried it alone to protect your husband from it until you were ready to deliver it safely." Patricia looked at him. "He thought I was cheating on him," she said. Steve Harvey closed his eyes for just a moment. "I know," he said. "He was sitting across from me every morning at the breakfast table for 8 months," she said, "carrying something he was not going to say, because he did not want to accuse me, because he still trusted me even when everything looked like he should not." She paused. "That is who Robert Coleman is. That is the man I have been married to for 30 years. The man who spent 22 years teaching young people to wait for the full evidence before drawing the conclusion, and then sat across from me for 8 months and waited." Steve Harvey pressed his hand over his eyes. "He waited," he said. "He always waits," Patricia said. "He has always been the man who waits, who gives the benefit of the doubt, who holds on to trust even when the trust is uncomfortable." She looked at her husband across the studio, at Robert and Earl, still standing together inside the door. His father did not make him that man. He made himself that man. She stopped. "But I think, maybe, knowing his father was watching from the back row all those years, I think that will matter to him." The executive producer stepped forward. The $20,000 prize was confirmed. Family Feud was contributing an additional $20,000 in the Coleman family name to an organization that provided transportation and companionship services for elderly individuals in assisted living facilities, so that men like Earl Coleman, without family nearby, could receive regular visits from people who showed up the way Patricia Coleman had shown up, every Tuesday and Friday, without being asked, without requiring anyone to know. The episode aired on a Thursday evening in November. By Friday morning, the clip of Steve Harvey saying you spent 8 months deciding whether your husband was ready to receive his father had been viewed 13 million times. By Sunday, it had passed 30 million. It moved with the particular unstoppable speed of things that answer something people have been carrying. Not because it was dramatic, but because it named, specifically and accurately, something that most people had never seen named before. The quiet protection. The love that goes ahead of itself to check the road before it lets the person it loves travel it. The sacrifice of being suspected in order to deliver something safe. The comment that appeared beneath every version of every clip, shared and reshared across 22 languages within the first 4 days, had been written by a woman who identified herself only as a retired nurse from Ohio. I spent 30 years as a nurse. We have a concept called care coordination. You assess the situation completely before you intervene, so the intervention helps instead of harms. This woman applied care coordination to her marriage for 8 months. She took the diagnosis on herself so her husband could receive the cure. That is the most advanced form of love I have ever seen described outside of a clinical setting. It was shared 19 million times. Robert drove to Clarksville the Sunday after the episode aired. He went alone. Patricia offered to come and he said no, not unkindly, not to shut her out, but because he understood that this was one of the things he needed to do himself. She had prepared the ground. The walking forward was his. He sat with Earl for 2 hours. He brought coffee, real coffee, from a shop near the facility, because Patricia had mentioned in passing that Earl found the facility's coffee terrible, and this had seemed like useful information to have. They talked about the Little League summer of 1977, about the paper route Robert had started at 13, about the high school Robert had built into something that lasted, about Marcus, Robert's brother, Earl's younger son, who lived in Chicago and did not yet know that any of this had happened. They did not talk about 1978. Not that Sunday. Robert was not ready for that conversation, and Earl, whose clarity came and went, did not push it. There would be other Sundays. There were not unlimited Sundays, but there were more than 0, which was what there had been for 46 years. Robert drove home in the early evening. He came into the kitchen where Patricia was making dinner, and he sat at the kitchen table, and he looked at his wife. She put a bowl of something in front of him and sat across from him. "How was it?" she said. He remembered the paper route, Robert said. Patricia nodded. He knew the street names, Robert said. Every street on the route. Patricia looked at him across the table. He watched from the back row, Robert said. Not for the first time, he had said it the night of the taping, sitting in the car outside the studio, not quite ready to go inside. He was still working out what it meant. It was a piece of information that was still settling into the structure of what he understood about his own life, and he was not yet sure where it fit. For 46 years. "Yes," Patricia said. Robert looked at his hands. "You knew that," he said. "You knew it for 8 months." "Yes." "And you were waiting until you were sure I was ready to hear it." "Yes." He looked up at her. "What made you decide I was ready?" Patricia looked at him across the table. She looked at him with 30 years of knowing him, the specific, accumulated, irreplaceable knowledge of a person who has paid full attention to someone for long enough that they understand them better than that person understands themselves. "You stopped sleeping through the night," she said simply. "About 2 months ago. You were carrying it and it was getting too heavy." She paused. "I decided the truth was better than the weight." Robert looked at his wife. "I thought you were having an affair," he said. "I know," she said. "For 8 months. I know. And you let me think that," he said, "rather than tell me what you were actually doing." "Yes," she said, "because if I told you what I was doing, you would have wanted to come. You would have made a decision before I had enough information to advise the decision." She looked at him steadily. "I needed 8 months. I did not have 8 months to spare for your feelings about the process." She paused. "I am sorry for that. I mean that genuinely." Robert looked at her. "You are not sorry," he said. Patricia thought about it. "I am sorry it hurt you," she said. "I am not sorry I did it." Robert looked at his wife of 30 years sitting across the table from him in the kitchen they had shared for 3 decades, completely honest. Completely unrepentant, completely herself. "No," he said. "You shouldn't be." Steve Harvey talked about the Colemans on his radio program the Monday after the episode aired. He brought it up without planning to, in the middle of a different topic, the way things come up when they have set up permanent residence in your thinking. She let her husband of 30 years suspect the worst of her, he said. For 8 months. She accepted the suspicion, she knew it was there, she could see it, and she did not correct it. Because correcting it would have required explaining what she was actually doing. And explaining what she was actually doing would have given him information before she was ready to give it. He paused. That is a level of self-sacrifice that I do not have adequate words for. She took on the pain of being suspected to protect the precision of the delivery. He was quiet for a moment. And then she stood on my stage and she told the truth. All of it. In the right order. At the right time. He stopped. She is the most disciplined person I have ever met. And she loves that man in a way that I did not know existed. Jasmine called her mother the evening the radio segment aired. He talked about you again, Jasmine said. I heard, Patricia said. How does it feel? Patricia thought about it. Strange, she said. I did not do it to be talked about. I know, Jasmine said. That's why people can't stop talking about it. Marcus, Robert's brother in Chicago, called on a Wednesday. He had watched the episode online. He had sat with it for 4 days before calling. He called Patricia first, not Robert. Because Patricia was the one who had been in the room he had not been in, and he needed to understand it before he could respond to it. Patricia told him what she had found in Earl, what had changed, what had not, what Marcus would be walking toward if he decided to walk toward it. She gave him the full picture, including the parts that were hard, including the declining memory and the complexity of what forgiveness would and would not fix. She assessed his readiness before she made the recommendation. Marcus drove to Clarksville in December. Robert drove with him. The two brothers sat with their father on a Saturday afternoon that none of them had known was coming a year ago. And they talked about a summer in 1977 and a paper route in 1978 and 46 years of back rows and the specific, irreversible, ongoing work of deciding what to do with all of it. It was not a resolution. It was a beginning. Patricia had never promised it would be a resolution. She had promised only that it would be safe, that the ground had been checked, that the intervention had been assessed, that the care had been coordinated before delivery. She had been right. She was almost always right about these things. On the first Tuesday after Christmas, Robert drove to Clarksville with her. He went inside this time. He sat in the chair across from his father and watched Patricia sit in the chair she had been sitting in every Tuesday for 9 months, and he watched his father's face when she walked in. The specific recognition, the specific ease of a man who associated this woman with the best thing that had happened in the last year of his increasingly uncertain life. Robert watched his wife with his father the way you watch someone with a patient, with the full understanding of what the care had cost and what it had produced and what it said about the person delivering it. He reached across and took her hand. She looked at him. You could have told me, he said quietly. Not for the first time. It was the thing he was still working out. I know, she said. For the last time, he thought. Because they had both, finally, said everything there was to say about it. Thank you, he said, for not telling me. Patricia looked at her husband of 30 years. Some love protects by telling the truth at exactly the right moment. Some love protects by waiting, by holding the truth safely, assessing it, checking the ground, ensuring the delivery will heal rather than harm. Patricia Coleman had spent 30 years of marriage and 30 years of pediatric nursing becoming exactly the person who knew the difference. Robert had spent 30 years being loved by her without knowing the full shape of what that love was capable of. He knew now.